You know, the bouncer is surprisingly good. As it stands, I think people tend to either like it for nostalgic reasons or really dislike it, probably because a YouTuber told them what to think, which is definitely not what I'm doing here, right? Of course, there's also people that are genuinely disappointed with what it is, which is also perfectly valid too. These perspectives on the game are a little skewed though. I feel like we don't have many takes on the bouncer that are fresh and unclouded by childhood memories or rage-induced bitter analysis. But as someone that just got here, I gotta say, I had a pretty awesome time, which I didn't really expect even with my newfound positive approach to the games that I cover on this channel. The Bouncer is one of those games that I always assumed to be bad in a hysterically funny sort of way, which is an example of when a game's experience becomes anecdotal to the point where you only really recognize it as that bad game. But recently I've tried to divorce myself from those notions and assumptions because I think that's a really boring way to look at games and art as a whole. Viewing certain things as bad just because everyone says they're bad is just it's just a bit of a bad mindset all in all. I don't want to assume the merit and quality of an experience via social osmosis, and when you start to approach things like that, I think you lock off a huge amount of really cool stuff to experience. It's something that really messed with my perception of some games I've played, with videos on this very channel being an example of that. DMC2 is rough around the edges, sure, but also has stuff that I do really like. But the video that I made ultimately felt very dismissive of that fact, and it's not something I really stand by anymore. Aesthetically speaking, the weirdness of DMC2 is sincerely pretty cool, and unique not only for the series, but the PS2 as a whole. There's genuinely some really cool shots in this game, and it's really the ultimate litmus test for breaking the hold that opinions of YouTubers have on you. That's 2 shots fired now. I need to be careful here. It has my favorite Dante design. I love how the movement feels with dodges and wall running looking and feeling so cool, and some spots feel like they'd be incredible places to chill. Like this sewer. This is a chill sewer. You know what? Hang on. This video is going to be about the best sewers in video games. Hang on one sec. Then you get into how weird and wild DMC2 is, with demon attack helicopters and having some levels take place in factories and cities and towns, and there's a real grungy sort of vibe to DMC2. Like, sure, there's nothing definitively amazing about DMC2, and it's definitely the weakest out of all the games, but I also can't deny that there's something about it that scratched my brain. Again though, none of this is to say that your negative experience with a thing isn't valid. If you went into something divisive or mostly disliked and thought that it was indeed pretty meh as a whole, then you don't need to feel insecure about having that opinion. Disliking art is as valid as liking it, so if you're coming to this video with that sort of mindset, I really don't blame you. The Bouncer is a divisive game for a reason, but I don't really care about all that. Sure, this could be a video that directly challenged some of the criticism laid against the game and trudged through Reddit posts to get some talking points, but that's really boring. I would much rather talk about the Bouncer on its own terms, divorce it from the conversations everyone's already had with it, and try to understand it without all the noise. And honestly, it seems like the general consensus of the Bouncer these days is a lot softer than it used to be, with people generally opening up to what this game is, which is really neat. This is a technically impressive beat 'em up with a modest attempt at telling a story presented with that classic Squaresoft charm, and frankly, that's all I really needed it to be. Any game that invokes the feelings of Final Fantasy X or Kingdom Hearts 1 is already a winner in my eyes, and that's undeniably a huge part of why I like the Bouncer in the first place. That cutting-edge early PS2 vibe is something that will always win me over. And I've talked about the early days of the PS2 feeling like a testing bed for some really cool vibes and ideas before. Is it rough around the edges? Yes, definitely. Are there some balancing issues? Sure. Probably. But there's also some genuine soul on display, hilarious gameplay with plenty of nuance thrown into the mix, and tons of little moments that stand out to me. In a good way, I have to add, in a good way. The experimental period of Squaresoft games are one of the most fascinating periods of history to me. Parasite Eve melds RPG mechanics, survival horror, and the aesthetics of a Final Fantasy game together to create a wild experience. There's really something cool about the modern day setting of Parasite Eve being built up with the art design techniques of developers and artists that were making games with big snake monsters and giant materia collecting escapades. Parasite Eve is grounded in a sort of realism that strips away a lot of what I'd say makes a late 90s Squaresoft game so distinct. We've got streets, rooms, corridors, and parks that simply look like bog standard locations that you'd see anywhere in the real world. Even New York City as a setting is pretty plain, with everyone having some sort of idea about what it looks and feels like, which strikes against the body horror aspects which literally contort and reform people's states of being into something unrecognizable. These environments have so much character specifically because they strike against Parasite Eve's wackier elements, which grounds the story so much more. And it's an example of Squaresoft making something that feels distinctly Square while obviously being very different too, which is where the Bouncer follows suit in a few ways. Then we have what is likely to be the most influential game that preceded the Bouncer and sort of kickstarted its direction, which of course is Guy's God Bless the Ring. I always wanted to have a 3D fighter that played more like a standard beat-em-up style game rather than the stuff that Tekken, Virtua Fighter, or Dead or Alive typically do. Give me full 360 movement, areas with platforming, and let the carnage begin. Guys is a pretty slow, clunky fighter with an emphasis on using character weapons or abilities to throw off your opponent. And yes, I am playing as Cloud Strife because what the hell else are you supposed to do in this video game? Yeah, you're right. I should have unlocked Vincent Valentine. I should have. But that slow pace, along with high, medium, and low attack inputs, is something that we would also see in the Bouncer too, which adds to what kind of game the Bouncer is. It's a beat 'em up with fighting game DNA at its core, and that's a concoction that ends up going a long way. The Bouncer's dev team all had a hand in creating modern-day RPG hybrids that all elicited ultra-chill vibes within the framework of their genres. Final Fantasy VII, Racing Lagoon, Tekken, Parasite Eve. And frankly, it feels like there's a little bit of everything in the Bouncer. Like this team at Dream Factory, and Tetsuya Nomura was there too, this is insane. Now you take that team and you tell me that they're working on a beat 'em up and I'm there minute one. You tell me that beat 'em up has pressure sensitive inputs, then you're giving me a feast. Metal Gear trained me for this game specifically, so I know I'm gonna have a good time. And a good time I did have indeed. The Bouncer is a buffet of vibes, hilarious action movie tropes, and some seriously cool design ideas wrapped up in a package that tries to offer something cinematic as well as schlocky. The Bouncer feels like it knows that it's not an ultra-serious game with deepest lore to pull from. We've got character archetypes that adhere to their roles perfectly, a bad guy who's a bad guy because he's got nothing else better to do seemingly. Oh, and he had a childhood seemingly laden with trauma, but we're gonna bully him anyway, so none of this really matters, to be honest. And we've got Lane here too. Serial Experiments Lane? Yet Dominique is voiced by Bridget Hoffman in English, which is amazing, and kind of hilarious given where the story eventually goes. All of this stuff is part of an experience that only lasts about 2 hours roughly on your first playthrough, which is then made longer if you decide to go back through the game with other characters and try to get all the upgrades and whatnot. Really though, who cares about ending things? You could make the Bouncer the only game you play for the rest of your life, so go ahead. Now, one of the things that shocked me when I loaded up the Bouncer for the first time was the sheer minimalism on display. Now, some people may call this menu design shit. I disagree. The main menu is silent except for these little beeps as you navigate the menu that echo out into the background. The options menu is made up of these really simplistic options that don't give you much to choose besides controller ports, spoken language settings, and sound. On the one hand, this sort of speaks to the elegance of the PS2, very understated sounds that imply this Y2K-laden future that we're all stepping into. Even the background of the main menu is just a shot of the city the game takes place in, with the logo in black placed on top, which is then interrupted by the intro movie that blasts onto the screen with an overwhelming montage of sights, sounds, and guitar solos. The Bouncer is made up primarily of these two modes, soft, quiet menus, and then a firecracker going off in a bathroom. I'll also let this ride for all the junkies out there.
The Bouncer.
Yep,
The fact that no music plays in any of the menus is interesting for all the reasons I just described, but it also feels like there's no music because they just want you to stop playing the game. It's also why the upgrade and save screens have no music. They are just there for you to do some quick and dirty RPG point spending before you head out and get on with your day. That's not to say I don't want some chill menu music, especially if we've got the Racing Lagoon guys on board. I frankly don't know why there isn't any. But what it does for the game is definitely interesting. Aesthetically, it's hilarious how simple these menus are with grey text boxes, mostly monochromatic backgrounds, except for exit being highlighted green. The only parts of these menus that are highlighted are the ones that get you out of them. Nomura wants you out of here and staring at these emo boys he made, and he did not miss. The Bouncer is also making use of, I said that kind of, the Bouncer. It's a fun name. It's also making full use of the full 3D environments to add a little more dynamism to the presentation. Static cameras and rigid fixed camera angles was something that was completely done away with in favor of cutscenes that have a ton of motions and expressions, and a camera that tries its best to follow the action in combat. Nomura's character designs go hand in hand with its presentation to give us some really cool looking characters, with genuine stories behind their aesthetics revealed to you in loading screen lore, which is frankly a genius place to put it. If you've got time to wait for a loading screen, then you've got time to read, so get your glasses out and do some research. There's this hazy atmosphere here too, with blur that softens the game's visuals a ton, to the point where backgrounds would struggle to pop in a certain way if it wasn't for lights and details popping out to give you some things to visually cling onto. That hazy, wintry glare gives the Bouncer a vibe that I weirdly do associate with those initial PS2 launch titles. Short game lengths can often spark up a discussion of value, over longevity, whether the full price of an experience like this is really worth that much, which nowadays is not really a point that matters considering emulation is a thing, and copies of this game are really cheap too. Sure, I think it would have been better if we got an hour or two more content to experience, especially since you'll only unlock about half the abilities on the first playthrough. But it's worth noting that you're really expected to play through these scenarios several times. That's why you've got a clear counter on your save file. And apart from getting more upgrades, you can get a few different scenes by playing certain characters on certain missions, which gives you alternate scenes that may reveal entire elements of a character that you didn't see coming. You see this guy? What if I told you he's secretly the smartest guy on the planet? Yeah, that's right. I don't know how that's possible either.
Volt? Wait, it's me!
Sticking with characters or mix and matching as you go through offers up some really neat differences that make each playthrough feel just a little different. And while I know that's not necessarily enough for some to consider that to be very valuable, I think that it's a pretty clever way of adding in some variation. If you like the adventure of the characters and pay attention to the loading screens, you get rewarded with some dialogue and scenes that give you some more insight into these characters, which is a lot deeper than I ever expected this game to be. Anyway, I kind of want to punch things now. The Bouncer's combat system is about what you'd expect from a beat-em-up partly helmed by the guy that directed Tekken and from a studio that had just made a 3D fighting game. And by that I mean it's actually not that similar except for the fact that I swear some of these animations are straight up from Tekken, which is incredible. I couldn't believe my eyes that I was seeing some Kazuya Mishima shit happen right in front of me. I can just never escape this man, I swear. You can play as Sion, Volt, or Ko, and the game throws this option to you after almost every combat encounter. And each has their own sort of play style that all ultimately do the same thing with a little bit of variation. Sion is the all-rounder, Volt is the big tough guy who throws enemies around like they're paper, and Ko is also kind of an all-rounder, but I think he kicks guys a little more on average. We've got three guys that do the same job in different colored fonts, and while the variation isn't that different between them, there's still a decent amount of stuff that sets them apart. Sion has a mixture of sweeps and throws that can be used to catch enemies off guard. Volt's moveset mostly consists of slow punches and kicks, but he's got plenty of throws that offer different utilities, like one where he lobs an enemy at another enemy like a cannonball. Ko's moves focus on throwing out more hits on average, which do fewer damage independently, but if you can string them together cleanly, he can be the most efficient member of the team. He's got some of the easiest moves to spam which certainly made some fights much easier to manage. Combat is interesting because it's a mixture of usual beat-em-up affairs with a more strategic sort of approach at times. You have to watch out for a lot of things at once, which include enemy positions, which attacks are currently being thrown at by enemies, where your allies are, and figuring out who's low on health first so you can take out guys efficiently. You get this nifty counter under health bars to let you know how many enemies are left and how much health they have roughly. And every now and then you can execute a team attack that shows our characters bullying an enemy, and it's phenomenal. At its core, the bouncer really wants you to be aware of your surroundings, especially if you're in a boss fight with a lot of moving pieces. Getting knocked down means that you can get comboed and potentially lose most of your health in a split second, and getting sucker punched by an enemy is hilarious when you least expect it, mainly because you tend to crumble to the ground due to the game's incredible ragdoll physics, which I have to admit I did not expect to see in this game. Functionally, that makes this game feel like a time-warped mix of two separate Like a Dragon games. We've got a stiffer sort of playstyle that's in line with the PS2 Yakuzas and the insanity of the later game's ragdoll physics, which is all localized into the bouncer in a way I simply did not expect to see. The bouncer clearly knows how funny it is, with a lot of its slapstick gags and cutscenes directly translating to moments in the gameplay. Its goofier aspects may seem like a point of awkwardness to some, but I really think it's endearing. You cannot tell me that some of these scenes aren't comedic gold on purpose. Then you throw in the fact that several of the enemies we beat up are just security guards doing their jobs. Or Co's segment where you have to communicate with mute guards via specific sign language code that breaks out into a fight if you get it wrong. I'm sorry, but I think this is intentionally one of the funniest games ever made. When I streamed this game, oh yeah, I stream sometimes by the way, twitch.tv/ghoulie_TV, go follow the link in the description. I found this game so funny that I couldn't stop laughing at various points. It's a very fun playthrough, go check it out. And when the game locks in and gives you some stuff that is genuinely quite tricky, I think the systems actually work pretty well. We've got high, mid, low, and jump attacks that make use of pressure sensitivity to control which moves get put out. You press hard to get some heavy hitting moves and lighter to get quicker ones, generally speaking, which is something I can imagine causing problems to anyone that isn't experienced with pressure sensitive inputs, but like I said earlier, I've spent my time in Metal Gear gearing up for a game just like this, and I was right at home. I think we really overlook pressure sensitivity as an input scheme. Sure, it's an awkward thing to make use of sometimes, but I always found its implementation in Metal Gear and now this to be pretty clever. Simplifying the quantity of the control scheme onto a few buttons pushed in different ways is a genius idea and can be pretty intuitive when done right. But I think that it only really works in a game that's paced like this. The bouncer is pretty slow paced in fights for the most part, with careful timing rewarded and almost demanded towards the end of the playthrough. Spamming attacks usually ends up with a boss blocking and making use of that opening. That being said, there's plenty of times where spamming certainly goes unpunished too. But the core loop does demand some patience from you, and that slower mentality is right at home with pressure sensitivity. You're almost guaranteed to make a mistake on an input at some point, but because of the nature of this combat, you don't have to worry about immediate repercussions a lot of the time. Hell, an accidental kick might be just the thing you needed to catch a boss off guard, so take credit for those mistakes, embrace them, and wear the God Gamer crown like you were meant to. The difficulty here really is sporadic because it can either be extremely easy or surprisingly brutal. Which one you'll find is dependent on a little luck if the AI decides to be passive or aggressive, but taking that slower and more patient playstyle will let you see the openings pretty easily. There's some genuine fighting game logic you can apply here, with moves literally being plus and minus on block. So throwing out a couple jabs to see if they get received and having the room to defend or continue the attack is a really handy thing to be able to do. And I think it's little design decisions like that which make the bouncer a better experience the more time and thought you put into it, because I really did feel rewarded for experimenting and messing around with the abilities of the cast. Upgrades are also this choice you constantly have to make between getting higher stats or new moves to use, and while this isn't super complicated in itself, I think these distinct choices at the end of every combat encounter do keep things fresh and evolving. After every fight, you've usually got enough points to get something which helps the game stay a little fresh, and you ultimately want to use the story mode as a way to unlock most of the abilities before you head into survival mode, or if you're truly a badass, you can go into the mode raw and see what comes out the other end. Then when you've done enough playthroughs and gotten the core abilities as well as some stat upgrades, you can go in again and steamroll everything. I've read a lot of posts about how people would just go through the game again and again when they were younger, and I can see why. The bouncer is short enough that you could probably beat the game in about half an hour if you were good enough. And sometimes having something so dependently repeatable and short like that provides a lot more value than you may expect. When all is said and done, I find it really hard not to love this game for everything it does. Like sure, the game's length is definitely on the shorter end, and the pacing of the menus and the game overs eats away at the game time, but for me, none of that really takes away from what the bouncer does well. This is a thrill ride that has you assaulting security guards, jumping from a train, to commandeering a hovering platform, to storming a building, and then riding up to an airship that controls a giant satellite in space, which doesn't actually sound all that crazy when I say it out loud like that. Huh. But you cannot tell me that this game is not an insane adventure, even if it is only an hour or two long. But it's the quieter parts of the bouncer that really speak to me. The design of the environments and how they express that neo-futuristic vibe. Even the stories of Sion, Vault & Co. are interesting as long as you read those loading screens. I think the bombastic nature of the game sort of hides a lot of the subtle beats of the story, and I think that's for good reason. It's not until you really try and think about the characters a little bit that the story becomes more engaging. I really don't want to spoil any of that stuff, but I'll say that Vault's background was definitely the coolest one to learn for me. To see what he was doing before becoming a bouncer. Oh yeah, this game is actually about bouncers from a bar, by the way. That's not just a quirky name, that's literally what they are. I'm just double checking because I feel like it's pretty easy to forget, considering where we go in this game. Anyway, yeah, all this stuff is very cool, so be on the lookout for it if you decide to play this yourself. There's this vibe with a lot of other content on this game that sort of looks down on the bouncer because that feels like the cool thing to do. Which always annoys me because that sort of thing really does miss the diamond in the rough stuff that makes the bouncer genuinely pretty good. I'm not immune from this sort of thing either. Like I said, some of my earlier videos were the exact same sort of thing, but now I really don't stand by that sort of thing in my content. I'm striving to see the good in the art of the things that I cover, and I really do think this game is beautiful in its own funny way. So I guess my key takeaway with all this is that you should play the bouncer. Respect what it does well, laugh along with the genuinely hilarious comedy, and try to pay attention to some of the smaller moments that are easy to miss. Maybe we can get a fresher overlook on this game now that highlights why I love it so much. I also really need to play Crimson Tears because that game looks scrummy.